Hi everyone, good evening and welcome to day 41. That's right, our magical day 42 is tomorrow. All right, t-shirt first. I'll get into it later, but I started out with be prepared today, so I had to wear my Lucky Grundle shirt because, may voice play sitting heaven above me and rain down bass notes on me. Today ended up being a very interesting combination of gold day stability, performer psychology, and one really strange realization that started in the car before I even got to my afternoon session. Okay, the morning I mentioned was be prepared, and it was primary, so it started exactly the way that I make a gold day stand out. Stable, sustainable. I'm not trying to have any new breakthroughs. I'm just trying to make sure that reliability is reinforced and the system is just operating. And the first take was 165. When I was singing it, afterwards I felt I was grasping for a description. I decided a little better than pretty good. That was while I was singing it. When I played it back, I kind of dropped that down a few levels. I realized that the energy was moving around more than I thought during the piece itself. One of the interesting things that's occurring in the whole process is gauging and understanding the difference between what it feels like in the moment and what it sounds like after it's done. But the take held together. Some parts were cohesive. Other parts still were not fully locking together yet. The one thing that stood out to me is actually toward the end of the piece. At the end, the chorus goes, simply why I'll, and Scar comes in and says, be king, undisputed, respected, saluted. There was something in the sustained vowels that never sounded right to me. Now, they weren't wrong, technically, but it really was feeling performed to me. There's an adage, if you feel like you're acting, you're not acting. And singing is slowly becoming the same way. So I don't mean theatrically in as much as I was performing the word. It just didn't sound like natural speech. And at first I had to ask myself if what I was about to do was cheating or not at this stage. And I went back and listened to how Jeff performed it. I wasn't looking to copy. I wanted to understand the intent and how one would sing that kind of a vowel. The realization when I listened was really quite simple. In normal speech, I say saluted, not saluted. And that may seem a little overexpressed, but I think one of the things that stands out is in holding that U up, you crash into the T, saluted. And that is a pop that just doesn't sound right as compared to saluted. Preserving how it would normally be conversed was more important than just sustaining a note. And that in itself felt like a pretty good realization, performance-wise. Now I have, because of my operation, I've been typing slowly. So I mentioned, I think, that I've got a new piece of dictation transcription software. And it was adapting today, sometimes, but I mean, those things take a while to kind of really gel against the voice. Then I did the second take. That turned into one of those extremely performer-specific mornings where the mistakes tell you more than the stuff that's not a mistake. At one point, I became so mentally focused on the word undisputed that I completely forgot what the rest of that line was. And I didn't sing the line, and then I realized I wasn't singing, so I started singing, and now I'm thinking about the fact that I wasn't singing, and I stopped singing, and I'm hopping from lyric to lyric, trying to recover, while the entire sequence is just falling apart around me. And honestly, I was just laughing. Immediately, I saw myself in a recording booth with the voice director outside, and he's just doing, he's just holding his head and shaking it and waving to me to go, no, just take it again. It's the important thing is that the image I had from it all falling to holy hell wasn't catastrophe. It was a human mistake, something that I know happens, and that it's not an example of my typical work. Not humiliating, not fatal, not the entire session is ruined. Just, well, that went sideways again. But I will also say that when that one fell apart, I didn't even go to playback on it. No. I did one more take. My general perception there is I'm not going to try to repair. There's no point. But, I mean, okay, that was a trash take. Let's just do a take and see if we can get a good one. It was cohesive. It was controlled. The bass notes completely not gone. I'm just sitting there mouthing the word prepare, be. So at this point, I think I'm over the why aren't they there, and just into the okay, they're not there today. Just move on. I'm still obviously looking into what is the bodily arrangement that does that. There was one overcorrection in that session, and I was trying something different with "You Won't Get a Sniff Without Me," and I knew it was going to come up bigger, so to avoid pegging the needles, I turned away from the microphone. Unfortunately, I turned a little too far away from the microphone, and I sounded like my threat was coming from about 50 feet away. Okay. Little tactical gaffe on that one. But the whole thing stayed together and mostly matched what I expected. It sounded like I felt. But that feeling of how do I position the body to get those bass notes, it left me wondering. Now, I was, after the session, off to the dentist, and I live in a city, and I'm on the east end, and the dentist is beyond the south end, so it's a good half-hour drive. So I play lots of music, and of course, it's Car Dru time. But something interesting happened, and I was singing a song, and I wish I could remember which one it was, but I was just casually singing along. I wasn't testing anything. I wasn't rehearsing. I wasn't feeling around. I definitely wasn't trying to prove anything. But the note that hit, I think for some reason I went to one of the other singers. And I opened up and that note came right out. But the thing was, it felt higher than expected. Not higher I had to reach for it, but higher than a note that I felt I would normally be comfortable with, let alone hitting. And I had that moment of, And I naturally, right after that, I checked with an F4, which, having now done it so many times, it's starting to become natural. But I had my phone piano on me, and I hit the F4, and I was like, that's lower than what I just did. And I hit the F4, and then I hit the note I hit, and then I hit an A4. And all those notes felt centered, available, without feeling like I was reaching for them. A lot of the F4s for me often feel like I'm a kid jumping up to grab a doorknob. And this time I felt like a baseball pitcher throwing a strike down the center of the box. And I'll tell you, after that moment, realized I was truly euphoric. And the really cool thing was the euphoric moment that hit had nothing to do with the fact that I hit an A4 or even an F4. During the A4, was feeling how that note was being engineered in my system, where I was pulling the energy from, how I was feeding it out, what I was holding back. And since I could physically feel how the system was behaving, I could recognize the difference between what I did in the car and what I did in the studio. And now I had the realization point of what I've been calling Car Dru versus Studio Dru. I could recognize what I'm doing there. I know what I've been doing in the studio, and I have been trying to understand the difference between those two settings. The immediate follow-up realization was also important. I was more open, and as a result, there was a lot more energy and a lot more volume for a lot less effort. So, my next calibration question stopped being, can I find those notes? And started from a point of, how much energy should I be using, assuming the system is open? And that was a really different direction for me going into Boulevard, which was my afternoon session. The entire session just had that realization hanging over me the entire time. And I shot for the first take, and almost immediately it felt like the energy line across the piece was traveling more in a horizontal line instead of breaking apart into little fragments. Now, the calibration take was definitely a calibration take, but it was a different kind of calibration take. So I could tell things weren't quite right, but these were entirely different things. So the first section, I still wasn't breathing. I'd actually been telling myself, before I start, deep breath. And what I had been doing, as soon as the music stops, I sort of let out a and so I had no breath support. And I missed it again. And since the breath support was gone, and I realized I didn't take the breath, I missed the upper note. So here we are into that cascade problem. But by the third line of that section, it was beginning to drift right into that situation. And the instability did not carry forward. It started to lock in similarly to the way it was in the car. The bass section was starting to flatten out. And I'm not talking flat in pitch. I mean flat in the sense that the energy line was running more continuously through the section instead of dropping, surging, breaking, recovering, dropping again. Anyway, there was also noticeably freer access to those upper notes throughout the entire Boulevard session. Now, I will admit, getting through that first one, I got confused because I couldn't tell whether at core what was happening was the new technique, the old technique, some other technique I just come up with, some kind of compensation, or perhaps some bizarre mash of all of those. And I don't know, but it probably was just some kind of mashup of a lot of different techniques suddenly beginning to work in tandem. And basically, if the sound is right and the energy is right, who cares whose technique it is? So that's where I'm focusing moving forward. But it did feel different. And it was a calibration take, so I decided I'm going to do second take. Now that I'm warmed up and facing the music that I know, that second time through became probably the clearest example to date of the system remaining operational, even when accuracy started slipping. There was a microphone distance in the first take that kept things too low. I was basically thinking, well, if I'm going to be louder, I should back up a little. Backed up too far. That's a technical issue. Came closer. Definitely had increased energy and increased volume, but it wasn't out of control. The waveforms in that second run through did not peg. The only way I can explain it is the tops of the waveforms sort of kissed the top of the ceiling. And as a result, it was the exact right amount of energy and projection. Okay, chorus. Section 3 is always where section 3. It was there. It held together better than I was prepared for. The chorus was sufficient volume. It was stable. The meter, again, no pegging. There was one weird artifact, and that was on the third line that begins sometimes. I did manage to sing my new sometimes, but I must have re-entered from the stratosphere in the wrong manner. Because when I came down, I suddenly had this fruity Kermit-like voice for the third line. And up to... Okay, I know. I'm looking for a different vocal color. Not that. I could just step back and go, no, that's not what I want. Maybe if I'm doing voiceover work, but no. But again, there was less of a feeling of something's collapsed. It was more like coordination shifted into some... Okay. When things went off the rails, they went off the rails so far as they went shifting into some other unknown neighboring state for a good minute or so, and then it would try to recover itself. And section 4 was there where that really hit. I hit section 4, the energy was good. I'd actually even found out the errors in the melody that I was unhappy with, and things are going along just fine. And the lyrics started to move around. I hit the last line, and I was so lost in lyrics, I just sort of babbled out gibberish in what I thought was correct tone and energy. And yeah, I felt like, yeah, I still maintained the energy and the pitch. And it all fell apart as I was doing it, and I listened to it, and it was a complete cascade breakdown. It may have been one of the strangest observations of the whole day. Even when the performance itself was derailing, everything kept trying to continue operating, and this time the entire system just said, "Oh, hell with it," and gave up. So everything was surprisingly healthy, but it did end completely falling apart. And sure enough, mentally, there I was back in the recording booth with my manager, with my voice started going 2 in 1 session, which just made me laugh even harder. So now that problem of me falling into the booth and getting a shaken head at is beginning to feel more procedural instead of catastrophic. And honestly, I think that's a really important shift. After the second run through, I recognized that maybe the loss of lyric at the end and the giving up was fatigue setting in. And I thought about it and I was like, yeah, it's definitely fatigue setting in. And things were drifting. They were getting out of state. So I just knew that stopping was the right decision. I also didn't bounce any of the takes in Boulevard. Some of them really captured pieces of this newer open coordination, but I initially started with trying to save every take, archive every take, know what's going on. But at this point, preserving inconsistent structure just because it shows some interesting moments that are where I'm trying to go, it's not as valuable as waiting for a take where continuity, freedom, lyrics, and the execution stay online for the most part. I don't want a perfect take. Well, I'd love a perfect take, but I don't need a perfect take to bounce. Just one that fits into my regimen of, yeah, that was a good one. I also think that's sort of a new, mature way of looking at this whole process. So there was a lot of fantastic realizations. There was a lot of amused vocal coach or vocal director looking at me through a little glass window. There were some really high notes just before lunch, and I'm really curious what day 42 is going to bring me other than a towel. So I think that's the right place to stop this one tonight. As always, thank you for following along through my experimentation, my coordination, my inner body visualization architecture, my vocal state, detective work, just everything. It's bizarre recording booth metaphors, but they're helping, and things are coming. So thank you again. I will be back as always tomorrow for day 42, the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Later.